Antonio Romano's name reverberated through the underworld of the West Coast, carried on the whispered conversations of those who dared to mention him. He wasn't just another gangster, he was something far more enigmatic, the Ballad King, a godfather whose reputation extended beyond the dangerous streets of Los Angeles and into the ears of the music industry's elite. A man of many faces, Antonio balanced his life between crime and melody, using his sharp instincts and charisma to control both realms with equal ease. But beneath his composed exterior, there was something far deeper, a quiet tension that only those closest to him could feel. The question on everyone's lips was simple: how did a man with such a gift for music find himself tangled in the dark world of organized crime? It was the combination of his lyrical talent and his hunger for power that set Romano apart from the typical mafia boss. His voice could charm an audience into silence, his lyrics could move mountains, but it was his ability to weave a narrative of loyalty and revenge that made him dangerous. Songs were more than just music to Romano, they were tools. Each note and each line of his ballads carried meaning, messages carefully crafted to send whispers through the streets and beyond. He understood that a man could rule an empire not just through violence, but through influence, and music was the perfect vehicle for that. Yet the paradox of Romano's life wasn't just his blend of art and crime, it was the myth that surrounded him. To some, he was a legend, an untouchable figure who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. To others, he was a mere illusion, a facade crafted by the media and the underworld alike, a man who sought to be both revered and feared without fully understanding the cost of either. His story would become one of dualities, power and paranoia, love and betrayal, music and mayhem. And within all of it, there would be the question that haunted his every move: could a man so steeped in darkness ever truly find redemption? Antonio Romano's tale is one that begins in the shadows but is shaped by light, by the music that carried him through some of the darkest moments of his life. It's a story of an artist who found his voice in a world that only valued strength and fear, and a godfather whose criminal empire was built not just on loyalty, but on the allure of his songs. As the years passed, his empire grew, his fame spread, and his influence stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. Yet, even as he reached the peak of his power, the weight of his decisions grew heavier. The question remained: how long could a man walk this fine line before the music, and the empire it supported, came crashing down? To fully understand Antonio Romano, one must first understand the atmosphere in which he thrived. Los Angeles, in the early 1980s, was a city caught between two worlds, the glitz and glamour of the entertainment industry and the brutal underworld that lurked beneath its shiny surface. Romano's rise to power didn't come through traditional means. He wasn't born into a family of powerful crime lords, nor was he trained from a young age in the ruthless arts of organized crime. Instead, he had something far more dangerous: ambition and a unique ability to weave himself into the fabric of both worlds. He used his musical talent to weave connections, drawing powerful men and women into his orbit without them ever realizing how closely they were entangled with a man who could be both charming and deadly. The public persona of Antonio Romano was carefully crafted. On stage, he was the Ballad King, a suave, poetic figure whose lyrics spoke of love, loss, betrayal, and revenge. He was a man of the people, a poet whose words seemed to strike a chord in the hearts of his audience. But when the music stopped, and the lights dimmed, the true face of Antonio Romano emerged. He was not just a musician, he was a mob boss, a man who commanded the respect of some of the most feared figures on the West Coast. His empire wasn't built on drugs or weapons, but on something far more elusive: trust and loyalty, traits that could be easily manipulated by someone as skilled as Romano. It's easy to be swept up in the allure of Romano's dual identity, the lyrical godfather who could strum a guitar as effortlessly as he could order a hit. But behind this myth was a man struggling to balance two worlds that were increasingly difficult to reconcile. His rise to power came with its fair share of violence and betrayal, and the higher he climbed, the more difficult it became to stay on top. His reputation as a mob boss was cemented with each successful deal, but so too was the weight of his actions. The songs he sang, songs about love and loss, began to take on a darker tone as the years wore on. The man who had once seen music as a form of escape now found himself using it as a mask, a way to distract both himself and his followers from the dangerous game he was playing. And yet, there was something undeniably captivating about Romano. He wasn't just a product of the mafia world, he was a man who transcended it. His rise to power wasn't simply about crime, it was about storytelling, about creating a narrative that others wanted to be part of. Whether it was through his music or his criminal dealings, Romano had an uncanny ability to make people believe in the story he was telling. And the more they believed in it, the stronger his influence became. But like all good stories, Romano's would eventually face a tragic twist. The very things that made him powerful, the music, the charm, the mystique, would also lead to his downfall. As he navigated the treacherous waters of the mafia world, the tension between his criminal and musical sides would reach a breaking point. And in the end, the man who had once controlled everything would find himself at the mercy of the very empire he had built. What makes the story of Antonio Romano so captivating isn't just the legend of the Ballad King, but the realization that he was, at his core, a man trapped by the very forces he sought to control. He was both the architect of his success and the harbinger of his own destruction. And as the years passed and the empire he built crumbled, the music he had once used to escape would become the very soundtrack of his fall from grace. Antonio Romano's early life was a stark contrast to the world he would one day come to dominate. Born into a working-class family in the gritty heart of Los Angeles, his childhood was shaped by the harsh realities of inner-city life. The streets he roamed as a young boy were far from glamorous, they were filled with violence, poverty, and the constant hum of a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Yet, in this urban landscape, Antonio found solace in music, a refuge from the turmoil that seemed to consume everything else. The rhythm of the city, the pulse of its heartbeats, the sway of the streetlights at night, all of it spoke to him. But it wasn't just the music that called to him, it was the promise of something greater, something that lay just beyond the horizon. And, unbeknownst to his family, it would be the very streets they warned him about that would show him the way. His father, a hard-working man who toiled away at a job that barely paid the bills, did his best to instill a sense of discipline and respect in his son. But despite his father's best efforts, the pull of the streets was undeniable. Antonio's curiosity about the world around him grew with each passing day. The men who frequented his neighborhood weren't just local tough guys, they were figures of power, figures whose influence extended far beyond the small blocks of Los Angeles. It wasn't long before Antonio began to see the underworld as more than just a shadowy realm. To him, it was an opportunity to rise above the limitations of his upbringing and carve out a life for himself that would transcend the ordinary. Yet, it wasn't an easy path to navigate. The allure of the streets was strong, and Antonio found himself torn between two competing worlds, the rough-and-tumble life of a neighborhood kid and the melodic, dreamlike world of music that seemed so far removed from the violence he was beginning to understand. His early exposure to music came through his mother, who had a soft spot for old-school ballads and romantic tunes. She would often sing to him as a child, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that made everything feel safe, even in the most uncertain of times. It was from her that he inherited his love for melody, the ability to feel the heartbeat of a song and understand its deeper meaning. As Antonio grew older, the grip of the streets began to tighten around him. His friends, many of whom came from families with similar struggles, were slowly being pulled into the criminal world. It wasn't long before he too was caught up in the gravity of that world. The allure of power, of wealth, of being part of something bigger than himself, these were the things that beckoned him forward. But it wasn't just about the money. Antonio had a deeper, more complex yearning, a desire to be someone, to be seen, to be heard. And in the underworld, he found his voice. His first taste of crime was an unremarkable one, at least on the surface. A simple robbery, a petty theft that was meant to be nothing more than a quick score. But even in that small act, Antonio felt something stir inside him, something that was more than just the thrill of getting away with it. It was the rush of control, the power that came from making things happen on his own terms. This was a new kind of music, a music of power, of influence, and it played to a rhythm far different from the ballads his mother had sung to him. As his criminal activities grew, so did his reputation. He wasn't just another small-time crook. Antonio had a gift. His ability to charm and persuade people set him apart from others in the game. He was a smooth talker, a man whose words had the kind of weight that could open doors. Whether it was a local gang leader, a small-time hustler, or even a wealthy businessman, Antonio could make them listen. His charisma was magnetic, and it didn't take long for him to draw the attention of more powerful figures. This was the moment when he began to see the true potential of his situation, not just in terms of money, but in terms of influence. He had always been good with words, but now he realized that those words could be as powerful as any weapon. But it wasn't just his words that earned him respect. Antonio also had a keen sense for what people needed. He understood the desires, the fears, and the weaknesses of those around him. It wasn't about being ruthless, it was about being strategic. While others relied on force and intimidation, Antonio knew how to get people to do what he wanted without ever raising his voice. He was patient, careful, always observing, always listening. And it was through these skills that he began to climb the ranks of the criminal world. Yet, even as his power grew, there was still a part of Antonio that clung to his love for music. The streets had given him everything he needed to rise to the top, but music was the one thing that still felt pure to him, a remnant of the boy he used to be. It became his secret escape, the one thing that reminded him of who he was before the mafia had taken hold of his life. Late at night, when the weight of his decisions became too heavy, he would sit alone and play his guitar, letting the melodies soothe him. It was during these moments that he remembered his mother's voice and the warmth of her lullabies. Music became his anchor in a world that was increasingly unrecognizable to him. Despite his growing involvement in the underworld, Antonio's ability to balance his criminal life with his musical talents made him a unique figure. He wasn't just a thug, he was an artist, a poet, a man who could see the world in a way that few others could. And it was this combination of artistry and crime that would eventually define him. His dual identity would become both his strength and his curse. The mafia world would come to respect him not just for his ruthlessness, but for his ability to weave stories that captured the imagination of those around him. But as Antonio's reputation spread, so too did the dangers that came with it. The more powerful he became, the more enemies he made, and the more he realized that the same charm that had won him allies could just as easily be used against him. Still, there was no turning back. The streets had taught him one invaluable lesson: power, once tasted, is impossible to give up. And as he looked ahead, Antonio knew that his journey had only just begun. The real game, the game that would shape his legacy, was still waiting for him. As Antonio Romano's grip on the underworld began to tighten, he quickly learned that the road to power was never as simple as it seemed. The first few years of his criminal career were marked by small-time schemes, petty thefts, low-stakes hustles, and quick cash grabs. But he wasn't satisfied with the mundane. He was a man with ambition, a man who saw far beyond the limits of his current position. It wasn't long before he realized that the world he inhabited had much greater potential, and so, like a musician finding his rhythm, he began to adjust the tempo of his life, moving from the noise of small crimes to the symphony of larger, more intricate operations. The first real turning point came when Antonio became involved with a powerful gang that controlled several districts on the outskirts of Los Angeles. This wasn't the kind of crew he had been hanging with in his youth. These were seasoned criminals, men whose names were whispered in fear and awe. They had connections, money, and influence that extended far beyond the borders of the city. To join them would mean entering a dangerous, high-stakes game, but it also promised the power and respect Antonio craved. The stakes were higher, the risks greater, and the rewards more substantial. It was here, in this world of organized crime, that Antonio would truly begin to learn the craft of a godfather. He started small, performing simple tasks for the gang, delivering messages, collecting debts, running errands. It was nothing extraordinary, but it gave him the opportunity to prove his worth. What set Antonio apart, however, was his ability to blend in, to play the role of a reliable, trustworthy associate while simultaneously observing, learning, and planning. He quickly grasped the inner workings of the organization, the hierarchy, the power dynamics, the unspoken rules that governed every move. It didn't take long for him to realize that the real power wasn't in brute force, but in subtlety. It was in knowing when to strike and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent. One of the first lessons Antonio learned was that in the criminal world, appearances were everything. It wasn't enough to simply be good at what you did, you had to cultivate an air of mystery and respect, to be a figure people feared and admired. He observed how the more senior members of the gang operated, how they spoke, how they moved, how they controlled their emotions, always appearing calm, always in control, even when the situation seemed to be spiraling out of hand. It was this composure that he began to emulate. He knew that the key to climbing the ranks was to make an impression, not just with actions, but with the aura of power he projected. As Antonio settled deeper into his role within the gang, he began to understand the darker sides of the business. The things he had heard rumors about as a boy, murders, kidnappings, extortion, were no longer just stories. They were now part of his reality. He was thrust into situations where life and death hung in the balance, where a simple misstep could cost someone their life. He had to learn quickly, not just the mechanics of crime, but the brutal necessity of violence in maintaining control. There were moments when he had to take a life, whether in self-defense, for the protection of the gang, or as part of a larger, calculated move. These experiences, while harrowing, hardened him. He learned to bury his emotions beneath a cold exterior, to see the world not as black and white, but as a series of complex, often morally gray decisions. In one such instance, Antonio found himself involved in a violent confrontation over a territory dispute between his gang and a rival group. The situation escalated quickly, and before he knew it, he was standing in the middle of a blood-soaked alley, watching as his associates executed the rival gang members. It was a stark reminder of the cost of power and how quickly loyalty could turn into something far darker. But even in the chaos, Antonio remained calm. He had been taught that true power wasn't in the fight itself but in the ability to control it. His unflinching demeanor in those moments earned him respect, and soon, whispers began to spread about the young man who could remain composed under pressure. While his reputation in the criminal world was growing, Antonio's ties to the music industry remained an important part of his identity. His involvement in crime, however, was beginning to overshadow his musical career, as the demands of the underworld consumed more of his time. But music, unlike the world of crime, was a world where Antonio still felt a sense of control. It was his escape, his way of expressing himself without having to resort to violence. The melodies he composed were not just for entertainment, they were part of his larger strategy. Antonio understood the power of influence, and music, with its ability to touch people's hearts, was one of the most powerful tools at his disposal. In his rare moments of respite from the criminal world, Antonio would retreat to his studio, strumming his guitar, his fingers finding their way across the strings as his mind raced. He composed ballads that told stories of love, loss, betrayal, and revenge, stories that mirrored his own life, though he was careful not to let others see the connection. His music became a way to communicate with his audience, a way to plant subtle messages about loyalty, power, and the harsh realities of life. His songs would later become anthems for those in the underworld, each verse a coded message, each chorus a call to arms. The lines between his two worlds, crime and music, began to blur. But as his influence in the criminal world grew, so too did the danger. The bigger the empire, the more enemies Antonio made. Rival gangs began to take notice of his rising power, and soon, the small-time hustler who had once been a mere cog in a much larger machine became the target of those who sought to take what he had worked so hard to build. In the criminal underworld, loyalty could be bought, but it could also be betrayed. And Antonio knew that the higher you climbed, the more precarious your position became. Yet, even as his world became increasingly dangerous, Antonio never lost sight of his ultimate goal. He wasn't just interested in ruling a small section of Los Angeles, he wanted more. He wanted the whole West Coast. But to achieve that, he needed to outsmart those who stood in his way. His ambitions were becoming more than just a desire for wealth, they were a deep-seated need for control. And as he worked his way up through the criminal ranks, taking on more dangerous assignments and dealing with more high-profile figures, it became clear that he was no longer just playing for survival, he was playing for the throne. The road ahead was uncertain, and Antonio knew that every decision he made would bring him closer to the top or push him further into the abyss. His rise had been swift, but the stakes were higher than ever. And soon, the price of power would become far steeper than he ever imagined. As Antonio Romano's influence continued to grow, his journey into the heart of organized crime began to take on a more complex and dangerous form. His reputation had reached a point where even the most powerful figures in Los Angeles knew his name. The street hustlers, the low-level crooks, and even the seasoned crime bosses began to recognize the young Godfather's cunning and charisma. He wasn't just a man who played by the rules of the streets, he was a man who shaped the rules to fit his own narrative. Antonio had learned from the best, and now, he was becoming a player in the game, navigating the underworld with a calculated precision that left little room for mistakes. At the heart of Antonio's rise was his ability to outthink his rivals. While others were content to rely on brute force, Antonio knew that true power came from the ability to control the narrative. Every decision he made, every move he executed, was part of a larger plan, a plan that was constantly shifting, constantly evolving to stay ahead of those who would seek to take him down. He wasn't just playing chess, he was playing a high-stakes game of political maneuvering, with alliances that were as fluid and unpredictable as the criminal world itself. One of the first major tests of his new position came when a rival crime family, the Diaz clan, began to encroach on the territory that Antonio had come to dominate. The Diaz family was known for their ruthlessness, their willingness to do whatever it took to expand their empire. Their rise in power was rapid, and their methods were aggressive. It wasn't long before Antonio realized that they saw him as an obstacle, someone to be eliminated in order to consolidate their control over the West Coast. Antonio knew that an outright war with the Diaz family would be disastrous. The cost of such a conflict would be immeasurable, not just in terms of money, but in terms of the lives that would be lost. But he also understood that weakness was the one thing that could not be shown in this world. So, instead of retaliating with violence, he turned to his greatest weapon, his mind. He knew that in the underworld, knowledge was just as powerful as any gun. The more you knew about your enemies, the more power you had to control the situation. He began by infiltrating the Diaz family's operations, using his contacts within the music industry to subtly insert himself into their circle. It wasn't an easy task, this required patience, subtlety, and the ability to read people in a way that few could. But Antonio had always been a student of human nature, and he knew that the way to destroy a rival wasn't necessarily through brute force, it was through manipulation, through creating cracks in their foundation before they even realized what was happening. He slowly began to sow discord within the Diaz family, feeding information to the right people at the right time, creating a sense of mistrust that would soon spread like wildfire. With every whisper, every calculated leak, he made the Diaz family weaker, until their once united front began to fracture. But this strategy was not without its risks. As Antonio manipulated the situation from the shadows, he had to ensure that he remained unseen, that his involvement was never suspected. The last thing he needed was for the Diaz family to turn their sights on him prematurely. So, he walked a fine line, acting as a friend to those who needed him and a foe to those who didn't. It was a delicate balance, one that required absolute control, but Antonio was more than capable of maintaining it. The turning point came when a key member of the Diaz family, a high-ranking enforcer named Marco, began to feel the pressure from within. Marco was known for his loyalty to the Diaz patriarch, but even he couldn't ignore the growing tensions and the whispers of betrayal circulating among the ranks. Antonio saw an opportunity in Marco's growing disillusionment and began to court him. He fed him the right information, making sure Marco believed that he was the one being betrayed by his own family. He planted the seed of doubt, just enough to push Marco toward Antonio's side. It wasn't long before Marco made the fatal decision to switch allegiances. In a calculated move, Antonio had Marco deliver a message to the Diaz family, a message that was both a warning and a promise. The Diaz family was given an ultimatum: either they accepted Antonio's terms and shared control of the territory, or they faced a conflict they couldn't win. The choice was theirs, but the message was clear. Antonio had taken control without firing a single shot. He had used his intellect, his ability to manipulate the situation, and his understanding of human nature to defeat his rival without ever needing to engage in a bloody confrontation. The success of this maneuver only solidified Antonio's position within the criminal underworld. He had proven that he was not just a player in the game, he was a master of it. He had demonstrated his ability to navigate the complex world of organized crime with ease, using his sharp mind to outmaneuver those who were once considered untouchable. But with this new power came new challenges. Antonio knew that the more successful he became, the more enemies he would make. And in the underworld, enemies weren't always content to stay in the shadows. They would come for him, just as he had come for them. At the same time, Antonio's musical career began to take on a new significance. As his criminal empire grew, so did his influence in the entertainment industry. His ability to blend the two worlds, crime and music, was something that set him apart from other mobsters. He was no longer just a gangster, he was a mogul, a man whose reach extended far beyond the streets of Los Angeles. His music began to chart, and his songs were being played in clubs, on the radio, and in the homes of the wealthy and influential. He had become a symbol of power and influence, someone who could command attention not just with his criminal empire, but with his artistic prowess as well. Yet, despite his success, Antonio found himself increasingly isolated. The more power he accumulated, the fewer people he could trust. The world of organized crime was one where loyalty was constantly tested, and even the slightest misstep could lead to betrayal. Antonio understood that he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. His enemies were always lurking, waiting for an opportunity to strike. And as the stakes grew higher, the game became more dangerous. Still, Antonio couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had risen from the streets, from the poverty that had once defined his life, to a position of unimaginable power. He had defeated the Diaz family, outsmarted his rivals, and gained control of the territory he had once only dreamed of. But in the back of his mind, Antonio knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, and the price of power was always steep. He had made his mark on the world, but now he had to protect it. And in the cutthroat world of organized crime, the price of failure was often death. Antonio's next moves would be crucial. He could either solidify his reign or risk losing everything he had fought so hard to build. As Antonio Romano's criminal empire expanded, the complexities of maintaining control over his territory grew exponentially. His rise had been swift, but with that rise came an ever-increasing set of challenges, both from outside forces and within his own ranks. While he had successfully outmaneuvered the Diaz family and secured his position at the top of the West Coast's criminal underworld, the pressure to maintain that dominance weighed heavily on him. The world he had entered was a world where the powerful were always at risk of being toppled, where the fragile balance between loyalty and betrayal was constantly shifting. For Antonio, every decision, every action, had to be calculated with the utmost care, for even the smallest mistake could lead to his downfall. One of the first signs that his control was being tested came when a series of small, seemingly insignificant incidents began to pile up. It started with whispers, rumors that were circulating among his underlings, questions about his leadership and the future of his empire. Some of his lieutenants began to ask themselves whether they were better off aligning with other powerful figures in the underworld. Antonio's rise had been built on his charisma, his ability to win people over with his words, but now that charisma was being questioned. The foundation that had supported his empire was beginning to crack. Antonio knew that in order to keep his empire intact, he had to solidify his power in ways that extended beyond personal influence. He had to prove that he wasn't just a clever strategist, but a ruthless leader who would do whatever it took to preserve his reign. There was no room for weakness in the world he inhabited. Loyalty could be bought, but it could just as easily be lost. His associates needed to see that he was a man who would never hesitate to act decisively, no matter the cost. And so, Antonio made the difficult decision to eliminate any potential threats within his own ranks, individuals who could undermine his authority or conspire against him. The first to fall was a trusted ally, a man named Vito, who had been with Antonio since his early days in the criminal world. Vito had been instrumental in expanding Antonio's operations, but recently, there had been signs that he was losing faith in his leader. The rumors about Antonio's leadership were starting to swirl in Vito's circle, and he had become more cautious in his loyalty. Antonio knew that if he allowed Vito to remain at his side, it could set a dangerous precedent. If one person could question his authority, others would follow, and soon his entire organization could unravel. In a cold, calculated move, Antonio arranged for Vito to be taken out. The hit was swift and discreet, leaving no room for retaliation. Antonio had the message sent loud and clear: loyalty to him was non-negotiable, and anyone who dared to doubt his leadership would face the consequences. The death of Vito sent shockwaves through Antonio's inner circle, but it also served as a powerful reminder of the cost of betrayal. It was a move that would cement his reputation as a man who would not hesitate to take extreme measures to preserve his empire. The remaining members of his crew understood that loyalty was not just a virtue, it was a survival mechanism. Antonio had made it clear that there was no room for dissent. With Vito's death, Antonio sent a message not just to his men, but to the rest of the underworld. He was untouchable. His grip on the West Coast was unshakable, and anyone who thought otherwise would suffer the same fate. The hit also had a profound effect on his criminal dealings. Fear, respect, and admiration, these were the emotions that Antonio evoked in others now. He had achieved a level of dominance that few in the underworld ever reached, and his reputation for being both a genius strategist and a ruthless leader became the stuff of legend. But the true cost of Antonio's rise was far more than just the lives he had taken. It was the toll it took on his personal life, the relationships that had once grounded him now drifting further and further out of reach. His connection to music, the one solace he had always turned to, was becoming increasingly strained. What had once been a source of comfort and expression now seemed like a distant memory. The late nights spent composing ballads, the quiet moments of reflection, were growing fewer and farther between. Music was still a part of him, but the demands of his criminal empire had consumed him in a way that left little room for the creative release he once cherished. The more Antonio climbed the ladder of power, the more isolated he became. His family, once the anchor that kept him grounded, had become an afterthought in the face of his overwhelming ambition. The relationships with his friends, those who had helped him along the way, began to deteriorate as well. The old neighborhood, where he had once been a part of the community, now felt like a distant world, a world that no longer fit with the man he had become. Antonio's ambition had come at a steep price. He was no longer the young man who once dreamed of a better life through music and modest success. He had become someone else, someone who wielded power like a weapon, someone who could no longer afford the luxury of vulnerability. At the same time, the underworld around him continued to evolve. New players were emerging, younger, hungrier, and more daring than ever before. The crime scene was shifting, and Antonio had to adapt. While he had secured his position in Los Angeles, the entire West Coast was becoming a battlefield, and rival gangs, entrepreneurs, and even corrupt politicians were all vying for control. Antonio had learned long ago that to be the king, one had to constantly defend the throne. The game was never static, and to stay at the top required constant vigilance and ruthless adaptability. Antonio's next move was to expand his empire into new territories, beyond Los Angeles, into San Francisco, Seattle, and even as far as Las Vegas. Each city represented a new frontier, a new opportunity, and a new set of challenges. Antonio's expansion wasn't just about acquiring more territory, it was about ensuring that no one else could challenge his authority. Each new city was carefully mapped out, each move calculated with military precision. Antonio's criminal network grew exponentially as he established new operations, made new allies, and crushed his enemies before they had a chance to gain traction. In order to maintain control over such vast territories, Antonio had to diversify his operations. He expanded beyond the traditional rackets of extortion, loan sharking, and drug trafficking, investing in legitimate businesses that allowed him to launder money and build a veneer of respectability. Casinos, nightclubs, restaurants, these were the perfect fronts for his criminal activities, providing both income and a way to move in and out of high society without drawing suspicion. He became a figurehead in the entertainment world, using his musical success to further elevate his status and connect with influential people. Antonio knew that the key to longevity in the criminal world wasn't just in ruthlessness, it was in blending in, controlling both the visible and the invisible aspects of his empire. Yet, even as he expanded and solidified his power, Antonio couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. The more he controlled, the more he lost. The weight of leadership, of constant vigilance, was beginning to take its toll on him. His mind, once sharp and clear, now felt clouded by the demands of maintaining his empire. And as much as he tried to control the narrative, he knew that he was becoming a prisoner to the very system he had built. Antonio's empire was growing, but so too were the cracks in his foundation. The balance between power and paranoia was becoming ever more delicate. In the underworld, it was not just the enemies outside your ranks that posed a threat, it was the ones within. And as Antonio's grip on the West Coast tightened, the game was about to become more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As Antonio Romano's criminal empire expanded further, his position as the undisputed king of the West Coast began to attract both admiration and envy. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. His power was absolute, his network was sprawling, encompassing everything from drug trafficking to legitimate businesses. He was a fixture in the city's elite social circles, his name synonymous with both the dangerous allure of the underworld and the polished sophistication of Hollywood. Yet beneath the surface of his success, the strain of maintaining such dominance began to wear on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The constant vigilance, the endless need for expansion, and the pressures of controlling a vast criminal organization all took a toll on his mental and emotional well-being. The first cracks in Antonio's seemingly impenetrable empire appeared in his relationships, both professional and personal. While he had always prided himself on his ability to read people and make powerful allies, the very nature of his rise had forced him to sever ties with those who once mattered most. Trust became a scarce commodity, even among those closest to him. In a world where loyalty was both a weapon and a currency, every person around him had an agenda, whether they were conscious of it or not. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about power, influence, and survival. And as Antonio's empire grew, so did the number of people vying for a piece of it. The first betrayal came from an unexpected source. Tony "the Shark" Moretti, a longtime associate and one of Antonio's most trusted lieutenants, was the first to show signs of discontent. Moretti had been with Antonio since the early days, helping to establish many of the operations that had turned the West Coast into a criminal playground. He was ruthless, efficient, and ambitious, qualities that Antonio admired in him. But as the years passed, Moretti began to feel as though he was being sidelined, his contributions to the empire overlooked in favor of Antonio's increasing personal involvement in the day-to-day operations. The resentment built slowly, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Moretti had always considered himself a key player, and now, seeing Antonio's growing isolation from his inner circle, he began to question his own loyalty. The realization that Antonio had become so focused on consolidating his power, often at the expense of personal relationships, led Moretti to wonder if he was nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. But Moretti wasn't the only one harboring discontent. Several other members of Antonio's crew began to murmur among themselves, sharing their grievances over the way Antonio had centralized control in his hands alone. They felt overlooked, even expendable. But Moretti, despite his growing resentment, knew that betrayal was a dangerous game. He bided his time, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. What Antonio didn't know was that Moretti had begun to form his own alliances, quietly courting other crime families, seeking a way to expand his influence without Antonio's oversight. His ambition was no longer to be a mere soldier in Antonio's army, he dreamed of becoming the general. He began making deals with rival gangs, taking a share of the profits from their operations, and positioning himself as a kingmaker in his own right. As Moretti's plot began to take shape, Antonio remained focused on his own plans for expansion. He had long since come to terms with the fact that in order to stay at the top, he would need to control more than just the streets. His business ventures had flourished, and his name had become synonymous with success, both legal and illegal. His investments in entertainment, real estate, and casinos gave him access to a world where he could launder money with ease while maintaining an air of respectability. Yet, the more Antonio ventured into these high-profile, legitimate industries, the more he became entangled in the web of corruption that connected the criminal underworld to the corporate elite. Politicians, law enforcement officers, and wealthy businessmen, all of them had become part of Antonio's inner circle, and all of them had a vested interest in keeping him in power. Yet, no matter how much Antonio expanded his empire, the threat of internal betrayal remained ever present. The higher he climbed, the more precarious his position became. And as the whispers of discontent grew louder within his ranks, so too did the threats from the outside world. The rise of new, more aggressive criminal organizations on the East Coast posed a potential challenge to Antonio's dominance. These new players, led by figures who were not bound by the old codes of loyalty and honor, had no qualms about using violence to seize power. They were not interested in negotiation or subtlety, they sought to take what they wanted by force. One such group was led by a man named Victor "Vicious" DeMarco, a ruthless crime boss whose reputation for brutality was unmatched. DeMarco's rise had been meteoric, fueled by a series of violent takeovers across the country. He was known for his complete lack of regard for human life, and his name alone sent shivers down the spines of those who crossed his path. DeMarco had set his sights on the West Coast, and with it, Antonio's empire. While Antonio had carefully expanded his territory through a combination of subtlety and strategic alliances, DeMarco was a man who believed in brute force and intimidation. He had no interest in negotiating, he simply wanted to crush anyone who stood in his way. At first, Antonio dismissed DeMarco as a minor threat, another hothead who would burn out just as quickly as he had risen. But as time passed, Antonio began to notice signs that DeMarco's influence was growing. His operations were expanding, his network of loyalists was deepening, and his ability to outmaneuver rival organizations became clear. DeMarco's reputation as a violent, unpredictable force began to overshadow Antonio's more calculated approach to crime. Antonio realized that if he didn't act quickly, DeMarco would threaten not only his empire but the delicate balance of power he had so carefully cultivated. Antonio knew that direct confrontation with DeMarco would be disastrous. While he could rally his forces and fight back, such a move would lead to an all-out war that could devastate his empire. He needed to outsmart DeMarco, something he had become exceptionally good at over the years. Antonio decided to employ a tactic he had used before, subtle manipulation. He began to reach out to DeMarco's allies, making them feel the pressure of choosing sides. He used his connections in the business world to create friction between DeMarco and his partners, feeding them information that would slowly erode the trust between them. But as Antonio turned his focus to the external threat, he couldn't help but notice the growing cracks in his inner circle. Moretti's betrayal was becoming more apparent, and the cracks in his once solid loyalty to Antonio were now wide open. It wasn't just Moretti, though. Other members of his crew had begun to show signs of dissatisfaction, resentment simmering beneath the surface, their loyalty to Antonio now in question. What he had once built as a tightly knit network was beginning to splinter. And the more Antonio tried to maintain control, the more fragile his empire seemed. At that moment, Antonio faced a harsh reality: he was no longer the young man who had climbed to the top through ambition and charisma. He was a man whose empire had grown too large to control with the same ease as before. His success had come at a steep price: his isolation, his inability to trust anyone completely, and the mounting pressure to maintain control over a sprawling, ever-changing criminal enterprise. The more he sought to preserve his power, the more he realized that the very empire he had built was slowly slipping away from him. What he didn't know was that the perfect storm was brewing, an alliance of rivals was forming, both within and outside his organization. And as the storm gathered strength, it would soon threaten to engulf everything Antonio had fought so hard to create. As the tensions within Antonio Romano's organization began to rise, so too did the external pressures that threatened to tear his empire apart. He had long understood the need for vigilance, constantly watching for threats both from outside and within. But even the sharpest minds can be blindsided by forces they cannot predict. What Antonio had failed to foresee was the growing dissatisfaction not only among his inner circle but among the rising criminal factions outside his sphere of influence. These factions, young and hungry for power, were quickly realizing that the balance of power in the West Coast underworld was shifting. The first indication that something was amiss came when a series of mysterious attacks began to plague Antonio's operations. It started with a few small-scale incidents: vandalism at one of his nightclubs, an ambush on a shipment of goods, and some of his enforcers being assaulted by unknown assailants. At first, Antonio dismissed these as isolated incidents, possibly the result of petty rivalries or overzealous competitors. But as the attacks became more frequent, he realized that this was no accident. Someone was testing him, probing for weaknesses. What had begun as minor skirmishes was now escalating into a full-blown campaign of disruption aimed at destabilizing his empire. Antonio's first instinct was to respond with force. He knew that in the criminal world, weakness was an invitation for further attack. His response was swift and brutal, targeting those he believed were responsible for the attacks and sending a clear message that his empire would not be undermined. But instead of ending the conflict, his violent retaliation only seemed to embolden his enemies. The attacks continued, each more brazen than the last. The tension in his operations reached a fever pitch. His network of informants was unable to pinpoint the source of the threat, and even his most trusted lieutenants seemed unable to reassure him. There was a sense of paranoia creeping into Antonio's mind. He was surrounded by enemies, both known and unknown. Amid the rising chaos, Antonio began to hear rumors of a new player emerging on the scene, a young, ambitious criminal mastermind who was quickly gaining notoriety. This newcomer, who went by the name of Alex, the Ghost, Santiago, had managed to remain elusive, operating under the radar, and gathering a following without drawing much attention. His rise was sudden and mysterious. Santiago had a reputation for being a ghost, rarely seen, rarely caught, and always one step ahead of everyone. Unlike Antonio, who had made his name through careful maneuvering and strategic alliances, Santiago's rise had been marked by audacity and ruthlessness. He didn't play by the rules of the old guard. Instead, he crafted his own path, exploiting weaknesses in the system and exploiting them to the fullest. The Ghost's approach to crime was different from what Antonio was used to. He had no qualms about using technology and modern methods to further his reach. Where Antonio had relied on his street-level connections, Santiago used surveillance, hacking, and digital warfare to target rivals. His operations were smooth, slick, and nearly invisible. Where Antonio had once been a shadowy figure in the underworld, Santiago was a ghost in the machine, leaving no trace of his movements. The more Antonio heard about Santiago's methods, the more he realized that this was not a threat that could be eliminated with sheer force. Santiago was an adversary who understood the modern world in ways that Antonio simply didn't. As the attacks continued, Antonio's paranoia grew. The once unshakable confidence he had built over the years was now tinged with doubt. His grip on the West Coast seemed tenuous at best, and his enemies, both old and new, seemed to be closing in on him from every direction. But the biggest blow came when Moretti, his trusted lieutenant, betrayed him. It was the final act of defection, and it came at the most inopportune time. Moretti had been with Antonio for years, and his loyalty had never once been in question. But over time, as the tension within Antonio's crew escalated, Moretti began to feel more and more alienated. The constant infighting, the power struggles, the growing isolation of Antonio, it all became too much for him. He began to question whether he was better off aligning himself with one of the rising forces in the underworld, particularly the Ghost. Santiago, in Moretti's mind, represented the future, a future that was fast-moving and unpredictable, a world where old loyalties no longer mattered and where anyone with enough cunning and ruthlessness could carve out their own slice of power. Moretti's betrayal wasn't a simple act of disloyalty, it was a calculated decision. He had been secretly feeding information to Santiago, providing him with insights into Antonio's operations and weaknesses. Moretti had even gone so far as to assist Santiago in several key attacks against Antonio's interests. His goal was clear: to undermine Antonio from within, to weaken him, and ultimately to position himself as a key player in the Ghost's growing empire. The betrayal stung deeply. Antonio had always considered Moretti one of his closest confidants, and the realization that he had been played for a fool by someone he trusted shattered his confidence even further. In an attempt to regain control, Antonio called a meeting with his remaining lieutenants, hoping to reassert his authority. But the damage had already been done. The seeds of doubt had been sown among his men, and now it seemed as though loyalty was no longer a given. The trust that had once bound his crew together had begun to unravel. Meanwhile, Santiago's rise continued unchecked. His influence spread like wildfire, and soon, even some of Antonio's closest allies were considering switching sides. Santiago's ability to offer protection, resources, and a chance at something new and exciting became irresistible to those who had grown disillusioned with Antonio's increasingly erratic behavior. In many ways, Santiago was the future of organized crime. He understood the modern world in a way that Antonio never could. His organization was sleek, tech-savvy, and capable of responding to threats faster than Antonio ever could. It wasn't just about brute force anymore, it was about being nimble, adaptive, and always staying one step ahead. In a last-ditch effort to salvage his empire, Antonio decided to confront Santiago directly. He knew that in order to survive, he had to eliminate the Ghost before he became an even greater threat. But this wasn't going to be easy. Santiago's empire was rapidly growing, and his methods were unlike anything Antonio had ever encountered. The more Antonio tried to devise a strategy to take Santiago down, the more he realized that he was facing an opponent who was almost invincible in his own way. What had once been a battle of brute strength and loyalty was now a high-stakes game of wits, technology, and strategy. As Antonio prepared for the confrontation, the internal pressure continued to mount. His enemies on all sides were closing in. Moretti's betrayal had opened the floodgates for even more defections, and the once solid foundation of his empire seemed to be eroding at an alarming rate. What Antonio had built, his dreams, his legacy, was slipping through his fingers. And the more he tried to hold on, the more he felt the noose tightening around his neck. As Antonio Romano's empire continued to unravel, the sense of desperation began to take root within him. Every decision seemed to carry immense weight, and every misstep sent ripples of consequence throughout his organization. What once seemed like an unshakable network of loyalty and influence was now being tested by betrayal and outside forces he hadn't fully understood. He had ruled the West Coast with an iron fist, but now, that iron fist was beginning to crack under the pressure. The betrayal of Tony, the shark, Moretti was still fresh in Antonio's mind, a wound that stung with every passing day. He had trusted Moretti like a brother, and now, his former right-hand man was aligned with a rising force in the underworld, a force that threatened not just his criminal operations but his very sense of identity. Antonio had built everything he had, his wealth, his power, his position in the criminal world, on the loyalty of those around him. To see that loyalty erode, piece by piece, was something he wasn't sure how to process. Yet, he knew that even in the face of betrayal, he couldn't let his empire fall apart entirely. He needed to act, but the choices before him were anything but simple. Despite his deep sense of betrayal, Antonio's strategic mind remained sharp. He knew he had to regain control over the situation, but how? Moretti's shift in allegiance had created a rift within Antonio's ranks, with some crew members questioning their own loyalties. There was a growing sense that the empire Antonio had built was too fragile, too divided to hold strong much longer. He could feel the shifting allegiances in the air, the subtle whispers behind closed doors that spoke of discontent and rebellion. Moretti's defection had sent a message loud and clear. Even those who had stood by Antonio through thick and thin were now considering their own futures. It was this vulnerability that made Antonio the target of other rising criminal factions, like Santiago's. Antonio had underestimated the threat of Santiago at first, assuming the ghost's rise was nothing more than the typical flash in the pan of an ambitious newcomer. But as time passed, and more of his resources were drained by infighting and failed attempts at retaliation, Antonio began to realize just how serious a threat Santiago posed. The ghost's empire was growing, and it was clear that Santiago's influence wasn't just confined to the shadows. Unlike Antonio, who had worked his way to the top through a combination of calculated risks and slow, deliberate growth, Santiago's ascent had been sudden, fueled by both technology and a ruthless disregard for the old codes of the underworld. He was a wild card, and he was rapidly becoming the face of the future of organized crime. As the attacks against his empire mounted, Antonio's inner circle grew smaller. Trust became a commodity more valuable than gold, and there were fewer people left that he could rely on. His closest allies began to distance themselves, unsure of where their own best interests lay. Even some of the people who had been part of the early days of Antonio's rise, those who had shared in the risks and victories, began to look for opportunities elsewhere. Antonio had tried to maintain control by doubling down on loyalty, by making examples of those who crossed him. But now, he found himself staring into the void of his own empire's decay, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. In an attempt to reassert his authority, Antonio called a meeting with his remaining lieutenants, desperate to show that his grip on the underworld had not yet slipped entirely. The meeting was set in one of his most luxurious properties, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Los Angeles, where the city's sprawling lights could be seen twinkling in the distance. The atmosphere was tense, a feeling that was only heightened by Antonio's once commanding presence now feeling like something far more fragile. He knew he had to act fast to prevent total collapse. But when the meeting began, something unexpected happened. His remaining crew members, those who were still loyal, could sense that the tide was shifting. They saw Antonio not as the feared and untouchable Don he once was, but as a man struggling to maintain control. The energy in the room was different now, charged with uncertainty and doubt. What had once been a meeting of loyal soldiers now felt like a gathering of survivors, each waiting to see who would make the next move. The power dynamic had shifted, and even Antonio could sense it. He had always been a step ahead, always in control. Now, he was reacting, not leading. During the meeting, one of his men, a low-level enforcer named Marco, raised an issue that had been on everyone's mind. Marco wasn't particularly high in the ranks, but his words struck a chord with the group. He asked a simple question: what happens when we're no longer the strongest? The question hung in the air, a haunting one. It wasn't just about the next step for Antonio's empire, it was about survival. What would happen if the forces against Antonio, forces like Santiago, continued to grow, and there was nothing left for his crew but to be swept away? Antonio's response was immediate, but it wasn't as forceful as it should have been. He promised retaliation against Santiago, assured the men that he would strike back with full force. But even as he spoke, a small voice in the back of his mind questioned whether that would be enough. Antonio had always been a pragmatist, but now he found himself at a crossroads: strike hard and risk losing everything, or pull back and rethink his approach. The truth was, Antonio had never considered the possibility of failure. In his mind, his empire was invincible, a well-oiled machine that could not be derailed. But the reality was starkly different. Every moment spent reacting instead of acting was a moment in which his enemies, both within and outside the organization, were gaining ground. Moretti's defection had already sent a ripple effect through the ranks, and now, with Santiago's rise, Antonio was beginning to face an entirely new kind of enemy. Santiago wasn't just another gangster trying to carve out his piece of the pie, he was a symbol of everything Antonio had feared: change, innovation, and an entirely new way of doing business. The meeting ended with little resolution, and Antonio was left with the uncomfortable knowledge that the cracks in his empire were no longer just cosmetic, they were structural. Even those who had been his most trusted allies were now questioning his ability to lead. The old ways, the ways that had worked for so long, were no longer enough to maintain control. As the meeting broke up and his men filtered out of the room, Antonio was left standing there, alone in the vast mansion that had once symbolized his success. The weight of the realization that his empire might be crumbling around him pressed heavily on his chest. For the first time in years, Antonio wasn't sure if he could maintain his position at the top. What came next would be the most difficult decision of his life. How far would he go to preserve everything he had built? How far would he push those still loyal to him, and how much blood would he be willing to spill to protect his legacy? He knew one thing for sure: he had no choice but to fight. But the war he was about to enter was unlike any he had fought before. This time, the stakes weren't just about territory or money, they were about survival. And Antonio knew that the only way to survive would be to adapt, or risk becoming a relic of the past. The tension in Antonio Romano's life had reached its breaking point. Every day felt like a battle for survival, a relentless war fought on multiple fronts. His world, once so carefully constructed, now seemed like a house of cards. What had started as a few cracks, betrayals, shifting loyalties, and growing external threats, had grown into something far more insidious: a full-scale unraveling of the empire he had spent years building. Antonio's mind raced as he thought of how far he had fallen from the untouchable figure he once was. The whispers that had begun as rumors of his decline were now becoming a loud, undeniable chorus. Despite the rising tide of uncertainty, Antonio was determined not to go down without a fight. His past taught him that the key to survival in the underworld was adaptability. The streets could be unforgiving, and only those who were willing to evolve with the times had a chance of keeping their power. But with every passing moment, it became more apparent that the rules of the game had changed. The criminal world, once so rooted in loyalty and tradition, was evolving into something different. New players, like the enigmatic Alex, the ghost, Santiago, had emerged, bringing with them a new breed of crime. This wasn't just about muscle anymore. It was about innovation, strategy, and the ability to outthink your rivals. Antonio's old ways of dominance were beginning to feel outdated, and the sharp mind that had once made him a feared figure was now struggling to adjust to the rapidly shifting landscape. The realization that the underworld had passed him by was difficult for Antonio to swallow. He had spent his entire life building this empire, believing that loyalty, respect, and fear were enough to maintain control. But those values, once unshakable pillars of power, were now crumbling beneath him. The younger generation of criminals, the ones who had never known the old codes, were not interested in loyalty or fear. They were interested in results. Santiago's rise was a testament to that. He had built his empire without ever needing to rely on the traditional structures of the mafia. Instead, he had embraced new technology, new ways of thinking, and an understanding of the modern world that Antonio simply did not possess. To make matters worse, Santiago had successfully exploited the divisions within Antonio's own crew, recruiting former allies to his side with promises of power and wealth. The betrayal of his old friends and lieutenants was the most painful part of all. Each defection felt like a dagger to Antonio's heart. They were not just business associates, many had been with him through thick and thin. They had built this empire together, fought battles, shared in the spoils of their victories. To see them abandon him now, to see them flock to Santiago's banner, was a blow that cut deep. And yet, Antonio knew that he couldn't afford to wallow in his own sense of betrayal. The clock was ticking. Time was running out. If he didn't act soon, he risked losing everything. Despite the crushing weight of his situation, Antonio refused to let fear dictate his next move. He had survived this long by being ruthless, by being willing to make the hard decisions that others wouldn't. Now, He needed to be just as ruthless in reclaiming his position. But how? What he needed was leverage, something to tip the balance in his favor. And that's when he realized the one thing that had always worked for him in the past: information. In the criminal world, knowledge was power. If he could gather enough intel on Santiago, expose his weaknesses, perhaps he could strike back. It would be risky, but at this point, Antonio was willing to risk everything. He began to reach out to his remaining loyalists, the few trusted men who hadn't yet defected. These were his last true allies, the ones who still believed in him, who still saw value in his leadership. Together, they began to gather information, carefully observing Santiago's operations and his associates. What they uncovered was both shocking and enlightening. Santiago's empire, while rapidly growing, was not without its flaws. His reliance on technology, his somewhat reckless ambition, had created vulnerabilities. He had made enemies, and there were those in his own ranks who were dissatisfied with his methods. This was the opening Antonio had been waiting for. But the question remained: how could he exploit these weaknesses without putting himself further at risk? To make matters even more complicated, the authorities had begun to take a closer look at Antonio's operations. The heat had started to intensify, and the law was beginning to close in on him. For the first time, he could feel the pressure from both sides, from Santiago and his growing influence, and from law enforcement that seemed determined to bring him down. Antonio knew that his time was running out. The window of opportunity for him to regain control was narrowing, and he had to act swiftly. It was at this critical juncture that Antonio decided to make his move. He reached out to an old contact, someone who had once been a key player in his organization but had since vanished from the scene. This man, who went by the name of Salvatore, the Brain, D'Amico, had a reputation for being one of the most skilled tacticians in the business. It was rumored that he had retired from the game years ago, having grown disillusioned with the constant violence and infighting. But Antonio knew that Salvatore's mind was still sharp, and that his knowledge could be the key to regaining control. He needed to convince Salvatore to come back, to help him devise a plan to take down Santiago. Salvatore, however, was not easily persuaded. He had seen the toll that the criminal lifestyle had taken on his former associates, and he had no desire to return to that world. But Antonio, in his desperation, was relentless. He promised Salvatore that he would be able to do things differently this time, that he would have the chance to create something new, something that didn't rely on the old ways of the mafia. He made a deal with Salvatore: help him take down Santiago, and he would be free to shape the new empire in whatever way he saw fit. After some hesitation, Salvatore agreed. And so, Antonio Romano's final gamble began. The plan that Antonio and Salvatore crafted was both intricate and bold. They would use the information they had gathered to undermine Santiago's operations, to create a series of distractions and conflicts that would force the Ghost into a corner. They would exploit the vulnerabilities in Santiago's empire, expose his weaknesses, and ultimately fracture the alliances that he had so carefully built. But this wasn't going to be easy. Santiago was no fool. He had built his empire on trust and fear, and he had a deep understanding of how to protect his turf. But Antonio knew that this was his only shot. If he failed now, there would be no coming back. The final showdown between the old ways and the new had begun, and it would be a battle for the future of the underworld itself. As Antonio Romano's plan began to take shape, the undercurrent of tension in the city grew thicker, more palpable. What was once a quiet, brooding underworld was now a powder keg, its fuse burning ever so slowly. The old kingpin was setting the stage for one final attempt to reclaim his throne, but with every calculated move, there was a creeping uncertainty. Antonio knew the game had changed, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This wasn't just about territory or money anymore, it was about survival. And not just his survival, but the survival of everything he had built. Salvatore, the Brain, D'Amico had agreed to help, and together, they started to put the pieces in motion. Their first target was one of Santiago's key lieutenants, a man named Roberto El Lobo Vargas, who was known for his ruthlessness and loyalty to the Ghost. If they could undermine Vargas's trust in Santiago, they would create a fracture in the very foundation of the Ghost's empire. Vargas had a reputation for being a calculating strategist, and if Antonio could find a way to turn him against Santiago, it would send a message. But that wasn't going to be easy. Santiago's inner circle was tight-knit, and Vargas was no fool. He had built his power on knowing who to trust and who to use. The first step was gaining leverage over him, but it had to be done carefully. Salvatore suggested they exploit Vargas's growing disillusionment with Santiago's methods. The Ghost had become more erratic, more unpredictable in recent months, and that had begun to rub some of his closest allies the wrong way. Vargas, in particular, had grown frustrated with Santiago's increasing reliance on modern technology and surveillance. The old ways of the mafia, with its personal touch and face-to-face dealings, had been replaced by cold, digital manipulation. Antonio saw this as an opening. He knew that Vargas was a man who valued tradition. He could use that against Santiago, exploiting the very weakness that had been growing within his organization. The plan was simple: plant a seed of doubt. They would arrange for Vargas to receive information, subtle, yet convincing, that Santiago had begun making decisions without consulting his inner circle, that the Ghost's focus on technology was causing his closest allies to be sidelined. Antonio knew that in this world, doubt was the most dangerous weapon of all. Once the seed was planted, it would grow, slowly but surely. At the same time, Antonio's men worked on infiltrating Santiago's network. They began to gather intel on his most trusted associates, looking for any cracks they could exploit. But every move they made had to be calculated. One misstep, and the whole operation could be compromised. For Antonio, the stakes were personal. This was no longer just about taking down an upstart, this was about proving that the old ways still had power, that he wasn't ready to be cast aside like an outdated relic. He couldn't afford to fail. The clock was ticking, and as the plan unfolded, the pressure mounted. Antonio knew Santiago was no fool, and the younger man's instincts were sharp. If they were going to pull this off, it would take everything Antonio had. But as the tension built, a more sinister reality began to set in. The law enforcement that had been quietly circling the fringes of the underworld had grown more aggressive. Authorities were beginning to close in on Antonio's operations, and even though he had always been skilled at evading the law, the growing heat made everything more complicated. The city was changing, and Antonio could feel it in the air. The streets that had once been his domain now seemed foreign to him. His world, built on the pillars of power and fear, was beginning to show signs of decay. Old allies were either dead or gone, and new players were emerging from the shadows. Santiago's rise had shaken the foundations of the underworld, and Antonio was no longer the undisputed ruler he once was. Now, he was fighting not just for power, but for relevance. As the scheme to turn Vargas against Santiago progressed, something unexpected happened. Antonio began to question whether he was still the man he once was. Was this battle truly about survival, or had he become a prisoner of his own ambition? He had always been driven by the desire to stay on top, to never let anyone challenge his reign. But as he looked around, he saw the wreckage of his empire, the remnants of what had once been a powerful, unified criminal enterprise. The loyalty he had once commanded was slipping away, and he was left with a sense of unease that gnawed at him every waking moment. One of his most trusted men, Carmine, had come to him with disturbing news. "There's talk on the street," Carmine said in a low voice, his eyes darting around nervously. "People are saying Santiago's empire is untouchable. They're saying that Romano's days are numbered." Antonio didn't say anything at first. He just stared at Carmine, the words hanging in the air between them. He had heard the rumors too, of course. But hearing them out loud, from one of his own men, made them feel all the more real. Antonio's mind raced. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, but now, he felt the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a vice. The world was changing, and he was struggling to keep up. The familiar faces of his crew, the men who had once stood by his side, were starting to look like strangers. Some were already beginning to entertain the idea of switching allegiances, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. His empire was crumbling, piece by piece. He had trusted the wrong people, made the wrong alliances, and now, he was paying the price. Even his closest lieutenants were questioning his decisions. The realization hit him like a thunderclap: the old ways of doing things, the ones that had brought him to the top, were no longer enough. He had to adapt, or he would be left behind. But could he? Could Antonio Romano, once the ruthless, unchallenged Don, reinvent himself in a world that seemed to be passing him by? The plan to bring down Santiago was still in motion, but now, it felt less like a mission of vengeance and more like a desperate last stand. Antonio wasn't just fighting for control anymore, he was fighting to keep his legacy intact, to remind the world that he had once been the king of the West Coast. The streets he had once ruled were now teeming with new blood, and the weight of history was bearing down on him with every passing day. But he had no choice. He couldn't let Santiago erase everything he had built. Not like this. Not without a fight. As the clock continued to tick down, Antonio made a vow to himself: he would see this through, no matter the cost. If he was going to go down, it wouldn't be because he had been outsmarted or outpaced. He would go down fighting, even if it meant destroying everything he had ever known. Because, in the end, it wasn't just about power or money, it was about proving that the old guard still had a place in this new world. And if he couldn't prove that, then he would have nothing left. As Antonio Romano's final plan to reclaim his empire unfolded, the tension in the streets became almost suffocating. The carefully laid trap had started to take form, but with every move, the weight of uncertainty bore down on Antonio. Every decision, every step seemed fraught with risk. In the past, he had thrived in the shadows, manipulating events and people to his will with ease. But now, his every move felt like a step closer to the precipice, a dangerous gamble that could either bring him back to the top or push him further into the abyss. The groundwork for his confrontation with Alex, the ghost, Santiago had been meticulously set, but there was a feeling that this battle was different from any other Antonio had fought. Santiago was a new breed of mob boss, calculated, tech-savvy, and driven by an unyielding ambition to modernize and dominate. He was not someone who relied solely on brute force or old-school mafia strategies. Instead, he used his knowledge of technology, the digital world, and sophisticated surveillance to stay ahead of his rivals. This gave him a distinct advantage that Antonio had struggled to adapt to. The old ways, the methods that had once earned Antonio the respect and fear of the underworld, no longer seemed enough. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Antonio pressed on. He could not afford to back down now. As he sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the maps and intelligence reports that Salvatore had painstakingly compiled, Antonio couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. The world had changed so much, and with it, the rules of the game. The mafia, once governed by its own code of honor, loyalty, and respect, had become something else entirely. The alliances were no longer as firm as they once were. The law had grown more aggressive. The younger generation, like Santiago, didn't care for the traditions of the past, they only cared about results, profits, and power. Antonio's once vaunted ability to inspire loyalty seemed to be waning, and now, all he had left were the remnants of his former crew. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Antonio's enemies had begun to take notice of his movements. Law enforcement, who had always been a distant threat, had grown bolder. The feds were now hot on his trail, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. Every day that passed felt like a race against the clock, and Antonio knew that his every action was being scrutinized from all sides. He was trapped in a corner, with his back to the wall, and yet, he refused to admit defeat. The tension reached its peak when Antonio received word that his trusted lieutenant, Carmine, had gone missing. It was a blow that hit harder than anything else. Carmine had been with him for years, a loyal soldier who had been through every battle by his side. But now, he had disappeared without a trace. Antonio felt a sickening twist in his stomach. It could only mean one thing: betrayal. And in this business, betrayal often meant death. His mind raced. Was it Santiago's men who had taken Carmine? Had one of his own men turned against him? The uncertainty gnawed at him like a ravenous beast, and for the first time in a long while, Antonio felt vulnerable. The disappearance of Carmine sent ripples through Antonio's remaining crew. If Carmine, one of his closest and most trusted men, could be taken without warning, then no one was safe. Fear began to take root within his ranks. Whispers of disloyalty spread like wildfire, and Antonio could sense the shift in the air. The bonds that had once held his organization together were now starting to fray. Some of his men, the ones who had been with him from the start, began questioning his leadership, his ability to protect them. Others, sensing an opportunity to rise, began to plot their own paths to power. Antonio was well aware that the appearance of weakness could lead to a full-scale revolt. His authority was under threat, and the cracks in his empire were becoming more and more apparent. The fear that had once worked in his favor, that had kept people in line, was now turning against him. Loyalty was no longer a given, it had become a fragile commodity, easily broken under the right circumstances. He had known that the underworld was a place where trust was earned, but never truly guaranteed. Still, he had always believed that fear would keep his empire intact. Now, he wasn't so sure. In his desperation, Antonio decided to take matters into his own hands. He would find Carmine, no matter what it took. The ghost, Santiago, had to be the one behind it. Who else could it be? Santiago's people had become more brazen in their tactics, and Antonio was certain that they had made their move to destabilize him. He couldn't let this go unpunished. He called on Salvatore once again, instructing him to pull every resource he had available to locate Carmine. They would need to act swiftly, before things spiraled even further out of control. But Salvatore was hesitant. He knew that going after Santiago's men directly would escalate the situation to a point of no return. Still, Antonio's mind was made up. He would not be humiliated like this, not again. The tension between Antonio and Salvatore was palpable. Salvatore understood the risks, he knew that once they crossed this line, there would be no turning back. But Antonio's desperation was palpable. This wasn't just about saving Carmine, it was about saving his reputation, his legacy, and his grip on power. It was about showing the world that the old Don still had the strength to fight. As they began their search, the walls seemed to close in around Antonio. The authorities were tightening their grip, and the whispers of betrayal grew louder by the day. He had once been the feared king of the underworld, but now, he was a man on the edge, teetering between survival and oblivion. Each step forward felt like a leap into the unknown. Could he truly regain his power, or had the tides turned against him for good? Every moment was a gamble. Every decision could be his last. The search for Carmine was just the beginning. In the back of Antonio's mind, he knew that even if he found him, even if he took down Santiago, there was no guarantee that his empire would survive. The world had changed. And Antonio knew that if he wanted to survive in this new world, he would have to adapt. But could he? Or was he doomed to become another casualty of the changing times? The answers, like everything in Antonio's life, seemed just out of reach, elusive, dangerous, and fading fast. The search for Carmine was becoming a far more complex and dangerous operation than Antonio had anticipated. Every lead seemed to circle back on itself, with no clear answers. His men were combing the streets, checking with contacts in every corner of the city, but the deeper they dug, the more elusive Carmine became. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, and with every passing hour, Antonio's frustration grew. Was Carmine still alive? Was he in hiding, or had someone silenced him permanently? The uncertainty was gnawing at him, but Antonio couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. He needed to find answers, and fast. The risk of losing his empire was looming larger with each day that passed. Salvatore, ever the strategist, advised caution. "We can't go rushing in without thinking this through," he warned, his voice calm but firm. "If Carmine was taken by Santiago's men, then we're walking right into a trap. We need to gather more intel before making any moves." But Antonio wasn't in the mood for patience. He was a man who had lived by swift and decisive action for most of his life. To him, hesitation was a sign of weakness. He had always relied on his gut instinct, and his gut was telling him that Carmine was in trouble, and that Santiago was somehow involved. The deeper Antonio pressed, the more he realized just how far things had gone out of his control. His men had begun to turn on him, sensing that their loyalty was no longer a secure investment. Some were actively distancing themselves, others were whispering about the old ways being obsolete, wondering aloud if the past could really compete with the power and innovation that Santiago had introduced. Antonio had built his empire on fear and respect, two things that had been invincible in the past. But now, those foundations were cracking, and the loyalty that had once been unshakable was beginning to crumble. One night, Antonio sat in his office alone, reflecting on how quickly the world around him had shifted. The flickering light of a single desk lamp cast shadows across his face as he reviewed the intelligence reports once again. His mind raced through the possible betrayals. Who could have taken Carmine? Who was looking to make a move now that the waters were so murky? Could it be Santiago's men, or was it someone within his own ranks? Antonio's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside his door. He looked up just in time to see Salvatore entering the room, his expression grim. Without saying a word, Salvatore placed a manila envelope on the desk and slid it over to Antonio. Inside, there were photographs of Carmine, bound and bruised, his eyes wide with terror. It was clear from the images that Carmine had been tortured, but what was most unsettling was the note that had been slipped into the envelope: "He's yours if you want him. But there's a price. Meet us at the old warehouse on 5th and Oak. Come alone. Or don't come at all." Antonio's heart sank as he stared at the note. This wasn't just a message, it was a challenge. Santiago wasn't hiding behind shadows anymore. He was drawing the line in the sand. Antonio had two choices now: he could ignore the message, and risk losing Carmine and whatever tenuous control he had left, or he could take the bait, risking his own life and whatever else he had left in this dangerous game. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Antonio knew that this moment could very well determine the course of the rest of his life. "I'll go," Antonio said finally, his voice cold and steady. "Prepare the men. I'm not going alone." Salvatore looked at him, concern flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing. He knew better than to argue with Antonio when he had made up his mind. The decision was made. Antonio would confront Santiago. As the night descended, the world outside seemed to blur into a haze of uncertainty. Antonio's mind was focused, his body tense with anticipation. The warehouse on 5th and Oak was a place he knew well, a place where deals had been struck and lives had been lost. It was a no-man's land, where nothing was sacred, and no one was safe. Antonio had been there many times before, but tonight, it felt different. The chill in the air felt sharper, more menacing, as if the whole city was holding its breath. He arrived alone, as the note had instructed, stepping out of his car and into the darkness. The only sound was the soft shuffle of his shoes against the cracked pavement, the hum of distant traffic, and the occasional creak of the old building as the wind whispered through broken windows. The warehouse loomed ahead, its decaying structure a symbol of the crumbling empire he had once ruled. This was the place where it could all end, or where he could take back control. Antonio pushed the door open, his senses heightened, every nerve alert. He was prepared for anything. Inside, the dim light of a single overhead bulb flickered as shadows danced along the walls. For a moment, everything seemed still, but then, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was Santiago, his face impassive, his eyes cold and calculating. I see you came alone, Santiago said, his voice smooth, but with a hint of mockery. I wasn't sure if you'd have the guts to show up. But I suppose I underestimated you, Antonio. Antonio's gaze never wavered. Where's Carmine? Santiago didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned to his men, who dragged a bloodied figure forward. Carmine, still alive but barely conscious, was shoved onto his knees in front of Antonio. The sight of his trusted lieutenant in such a state hit Antonio like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat as he moved forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Carmine, Antonio murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion. But the man before him barely responded, his eyes glazed over with pain and fear. Santiago chuckled softly, as if amused by Antonio's visible reaction. He's lucky to be alive. But I think you're starting to see the bigger picture now, Antonio. You're old. Your time is done. You're not in control anymore. The words hit harder than anything Santiago had done up to this point. Antonio felt his anger rising, but he knew he had to stay calm. The last thing he needed was to lose his temper and make a mistake. What do you want? Antonio asked, his voice colder now, his posture rigid with defiance. Santiago's smirk widened. I want you to admit it, Antonio. That your time is over. That the old ways are dead. And once you do, maybe I'll let you walk out of here alive. It was a challenge, pure and simple. Santiago was testing Antonio, pushing him to see how far he could go. Antonio knew that there was no turning back now. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to bow down to the new generation. With every ounce of strength he had left, Antonio straightened his back and locked eyes with Santiago. You don't get it, Antonio said, his voice low but full of power. I'm not here to survive. I'm here to remind you who built this empire. You think you can take it all away from me? You're mistaken. You'll never have what I have. Not now, not ever. Santiago's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in an instant, the game shifted once again. The moments following Antonio's defiant words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. There was an almost tangible silence, the kind that precedes violence, a silence that made Antonio's heart race. Santiago was a dangerous man, and he knew how to play the game. But Antonio was no stranger to pressure either. His gaze never left Santiago's, even as the tension in the room reached its peak. His mind raced through every possible outcome, each one darker than the last. He had come to this warehouse with a singular goal, to reclaim Carmine, to show Santiago that he was not yet done. But now, with Carmine's life hanging in the balance, Antonio's resolve was being tested like never before. He could feel the weight of everything he had built pressing down on him, and in that moment, he understood just how fragile his empire had become. Santiago took a step closer, his smirk never faltering. The smugness in his eyes was unsettling, like he already knew how this would end. You don't get it, do you? Santiago's voice was smooth, almost comforting, but there was a razor-sharp edge beneath his calm demeanor. You're stuck in the past. You're holding on to a world that no longer exists. The game's changed, Antonio. And you're out of your depth. Antonio's fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. I built this city. I built this empire. You think I'm going to let you tear it down without a fight? His words were sharp, laced with the authority he had once carried effortlessly. But even as he spoke, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Was Santiago right? Had he become a relic of a bygone era, clinging to power while the world around him had moved on? Santiago, as if sensing Antonio's internal struggle, tilted his head slightly, his smile widening. It's not just about power anymore. It's about survival. And I have what it takes to survive. You don't. You never did. The words cut deeper than Antonio cared to admit. His pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, he saw flashes of his younger self, strong, decisive, a leader who inspired fear and loyalty in equal measure. That man was still inside him, buried beneath the weight of years spent in the shadows. But now, as he looked at Santiago, he saw a new breed of leader, someone who was willing to adapt, someone who embraced the changing times. And Antonio realized with a sinking feeling that he had been clinging to a dying model of power. But he wasn't ready to concede just yet. With a swift movement, Antonio stepped toward Carmine, his eyes scanning the bloodied form of his trusted lieutenant. His heart clenched at the sight. Carmine, the man who had stood by his side for so long, now reduced to this. The guilt threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. The stakes were too high. Santiago's voice broke through his thoughts. You can't save him, Antonio. He's as good as dead. You're too late. Antonio's gaze hardened, his jaw clenched. We'll see about that. His words were not just for Santiago, they were for himself as much as they were for the man standing in front of him. Santiago made a dismissive gesture, signaling to one of his men. The thug stepped forward, a knife in hand, and Antonio's eyes followed every movement. It was clear that Santiago was toying with him, trying to provoke him into making a mistake. But Antonio had lived through worse situations than this. He had survived betrayals, shootouts, and the constant threat of death. He wasn't going to let Santiago's mind games get to him. Instead, Antonio took a deep breath and refocused. This wasn't just about saving Carmine, it was about proving to Santiago, to everyone, that Antonio Romano was not a man to be underestimated. He would not go quietly into the night. He would fight for his legacy, for everything he had built, and for the respect he had earned over decades. I'm not leaving without Carmine, Antonio said, his voice unwavering. Santiago's expression flickered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with his usual calm demeanor. He took a step back, as if considering Antonio's words. Fine. But it's not going to be that simple. You want him? You'll have to earn him back. You're going to have to fight for him. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Antonio felt the weight of the situation. Santiago was right in one respect, this wasn't going to be easy. The power dynamic had shifted, and Antonio was no longer the man with all the control. The rules of the game had changed, and he was now playing catch-up. But Antonio wasn't one to back down from a challenge. I'll fight for him, Antonio said with a steely determination. And I'll fight for my empire. Santiago's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Antonio could see it, a crack in the veneer of invulnerability that Santiago had built around himself. The younger man was used to getting what he wanted, but he wasn't used to this kind of resistance. Antonio had seen it before, the way people underestimated him, the way they thought they could push him around. It was a mistake they all made. Santiago motioned to his men, signaling that the game was about to begin. A few of them moved forward, circling Antonio and Carmine, their faces tense with anticipation. Antonio's instincts kicked in, his body alert and ready. He knew that this could turn deadly in an instant, and he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Let's see if you're still the man you once were, Santiago said, his voice low and full of menace. The tension in the room escalated, but Antonio remained calm. He had faced worse odds than this and come out on top. Santiago may have the advantage of numbers, but Antonio had something more valuable, experience. And experience, Antonio knew, was something that no amount of technology or power could replicate. As the seconds stretched into eternity, Antonio's mind raced. He had to think fast. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. His hand subtly reached into his coat pocket, where he kept a concealed weapon, one he'd relied on in more than one tight spot. But he wasn't ready to make his move yet. Not until the right moment. Carmine groaned from the ground, his pain evident, and Antonio's resolve hardened. He would not let this end in failure. He would not lose his lieutenant, his empire, or his legacy. Not like this. Santiago, sensing the shift in Antonio's demeanor, stepped back, raising a hand to signal his men to pause. I see the fire in your eyes, Antonio. But I'm not going to make this easy for you. Antonio's eyes narrowed. I don't need it easy. I need to win. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything Antonio had fought for. His legacy, his empire, his future, it all came down to this moment. Would he prevail? Or would this be the final chapter of the Ballad King's reign? The atmosphere in the warehouse was suffocating, charged with an intensity that seemed to tighten around Antonio's chest with every passing second. Santiago's men formed a loose circle around him, their faces unreadable but their hands hovering near weapons, waiting for a signal, a single move that would set off the storm. Antonio could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he didn't let it rattle him. He had been in tighter spots before, had faced down enemies far more ruthless than Santiago's underlings. But this felt different. There was something personal about this confrontation. Santiago wasn't just a rival, he was a reflection of everything Antonio had once been, and everything he had lost. For a moment, Antonio glanced at Carmine again. His loyal lieutenant was still kneeling, his face pale and bruised, but his eyes were locked on Antonio's, filled with a silent plea for help. It was a reminder of everything Antonio had fought for, his men, his legacy, and the unspoken bond between them all. He couldn't fail Carmine, not now. Santiago stepped forward, his footsteps echoing ominously in the dimly lit warehouse. His eyes gleamed with a mix of amusement and superiority, like a predator sizing up its prey. You're still holding on to that old sense of pride, Antonio. But it's a dying thing. People like you and me, we don't last forever. The world changes. It moves on. Antonio's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Santiago's words get under his skin. Maybe you're right. But I'm not done yet. Santiago's smirk deepened. You think you can still win this? You think you can take it all back, after everything that's happened? He shook his head slowly, almost pitying Antonio. It's over, Antonio. Your time has passed. Antonio's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained even. The past doesn't just disappear. It's not as easy to erase as you think. Is it? Santiago asked, his tone suddenly cold, like a knife blade being drawn across a stone. Because I've been busy, Antonio. While you've been sitting on your hands, reminiscing about the glory days, I've been building something new. Something better. You haven't even seen the beginning of what I'm capable of. And that's why I'm going to win. Antonio's mind raced, but he kept his face impassive. He had to play this carefully. If Santiago was so certain of his victory, then Antonio had to exploit that overconfidence. He had to give Santiago just enough rope to hang himself. Is that so? Antonio asked, his voice low, almost soothing. He took a step forward, not backing down but moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who knew the game. Then why don't you show me? Why don't you prove to me that you can do it better? Santiago's eyes narrowed, the challenge in Antonio's words hitting a nerve. For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in Santiago's eyes, but it was gone in an instant. He quickly masked it with a casual chuckle, as though he had been expecting this. I don't have to prove anything to you, Antonio. You'll see soon enough. But you're right about one thing, we're not done yet. Not until I say we are. And with that, Santiago made a subtle motion with his hand, signaling his men to move in. The tension in the room ratcheted up immediately. Antonio's pulse quickened, but his hand remained steady. Every instinct in his body told him to act, to strike first before they closed in, but something told him to wait. To play this game just a little longer. He had to be sure. The first of Santiago's men lunged forward, a hulking figure with a gun drawn. But before he could reach Antonio, he froze, eyes wide, and his gun fell to the floor with a clatter. It wasn't fear that stopped him, it was a sudden realization, a moment of confusion. The man glanced around, his gaze darting between his comrades, unsure of what was happening. It was then that Antonio noticed the slight twitch in Santiago's posture, the smallest indication that the younger man had just realized something wasn't right. Antonio didn't waste the opportunity. He moved with lightning speed, grabbing the fallen gun before anyone could react. The men around him hesitated, thrown off balance by the sudden shift in power. In one fluid motion, Antonio leveled the weapon at the closest man, his eyes never leaving Santiago's. The room held its breath. "You made one mistake, Santiago," Antonio said, his voice calm but deadly. "You underestimated me." Santiago's face darkened, his confidence faltering for the first time. He motioned for his men to back off, his earlier bravado gone. "You think this is over? You think you can just walk away from this?" His voice was laced with venom now, a far cry from the cool, collected tone he'd used earlier. "You're a fool, Antonio. You've made a serious mistake." Antonio didn't respond, his eyes cold and focused as he kept the gun trained on Santiago's men. The silence in the room was deafening, every breath held in anticipation of the next move. Antonio knew that he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. One wrong move, and it could all be over. But he also knew that he had the upper hand now. He had reclaimed control of the situation, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Antonio felt the familiar rush of power coursing through him. This was his world, his empire. Santiago might have been the new face of power, but Antonio wasn't ready to fade into obscurity just yet. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Santiago, his eyes never leaving the younger man's face. "You've made your play, Santiago. Now it's my turn." For a moment, it seemed like Santiago might try to argue, to continue pushing his advantage. But instead, there was a shift, a recognition that this was not a fight he could win. Antonio's presence was undeniable, and even Santiago had to acknowledge that. With a deep breath, Antonio lowered the gun just slightly, his finger still hovering near the trigger. The tension in the air didn't dissipate, but it was tempered now with a new understanding. Antonio was not going to let this empire slip away so easily. Carmine, though still weak and disoriented, was looking up at Antonio now, a silent gratitude in his eyes. Antonio nodded once, a silent promise. He would get him out of here. And he would reclaim his empire, no matter the cost. As the standoff continued, both men locked in an unspoken battle of wills. Antonio knew this was far from over. But it was a battle he wasn't about to lose. The old ways had been challenged, but Antonio wasn't ready to fade into the past. He would fight for his legacy. He would fight for Carmine. And above all, he would fight to remind Santiago, and the world, that the Ballad King had not yet sung his final song. The silence between them lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. Antonio could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a vice. His fingers, still clutching the gun, were steady but his mind raced. Santiago's confidence had wavered, but that didn't mean the danger had passed. It wasn't over yet. It couldn't be. Not until he had everything he came for. Santiago's men were restless, shifting uneasily, their eyes flickering between Antonio and their boss. Antonio knew they weren't afraid of him, not yet, but he could feel the subtle shift in the room. Santiago's once dominant presence was starting to lose its grip. That in itself was a victory, but Antonio knew better than to get cocky. This wasn't about a small win. This was about survival. And survival in this world was a game of inches. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and everything could come crashing down. "Go ahead," Santiago said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Shoot me. But I think we both know what happens next." His eyes locked onto Antonio's, his gaze unwavering, like a snake coiling, waiting for the right moment to strike. You take me down, and my men will tear you apart. You'll never walk out of here alive. Antonio's eyes never left Santiago's. The threat was real. Santiago had the numbers, and in the end, numbers mattered more than any individual. But Antonio wasn't concerned about dying. Not right now. The truth was, he had already lived on borrowed time. What mattered was the legacy, the empire, and the men who had put their trust in him. He couldn't let it all slip away, not after everything. I don't need to kill you to make my point, Antonio said softly, his voice calm but laced with steel. I just need to remind you who's in charge. Santiago's lips twisted into a smile, but there was no humor in it. You're delusional if you think you still have any control here. His eyes narrowed, calculating, and for the first time, Antonio saw a flicker of uncertainty in his adversary's eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. Santiago was starting to realize that the game had changed, that the power he had once wielded so effortlessly wasn't as secure as he thought. Antonio didn't move, his posture relaxed but poised, every muscle in his body ready to react at the slightest provocation. He knew Santiago had underestimated him. The younger man had come into this with one goal in mind: obliterate Antonio, take control of his territory, and step into his shoes as the new power on the coast. But Antonio wasn't going to make it that easy. He glanced at Carmine again. His loyal lieutenant was still on the floor, though he was stirring slightly, his eyes tracking Antonio's every move. Antonio's heart clenched at the sight. Carmine had been with him through it all, through the highs and the lows, the victories and the betrayals. Losing him wasn't just a matter of loyalty, it was a blow to everything Antonio had built. But even as his thoughts lingered on his friend's fate, he pushed it aside. There was no room for sentiment in this moment. The stakes were too high. You're running out of time, Santiago said, breaking Antonio's concentration. His voice was quieter now, almost like a whisper, but there was an edge to it, like he was trying to draw Antonio in, get him to act on impulse. The people you're trying to protect. They're already dead. You're too late. And when it's all over, all you'll have is your pride, and that won't mean a damn thing. Antonio's grip on the gun tightened, but his eyes stayed locked on Santiago. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but Antonio wasn't about to lose. Not now. Not after everything he had sacrificed. He had spent years building his empire, one piece at a time, and it was never easy. The world of organized crime wasn't kind, and neither were the people in it. But Antonio had learned how to navigate those treacherous waters. He had learned to survive, and now it was time to remind everyone, including Santiago, that no matter how hard they pushed, Antonio Romano would not break. I'm not interested in your threats, Santiago, Antonio said, his voice low and controlled. What you fail to understand is that I'm not here to play by your rules. He took a step forward, the cold barrel of the gun still aimed at the younger man's chest. You're the one who's out of your depth. And you're the one who's going to regret underestimating me. Santiago's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, a flicker of panic passing through his eyes. Antonio had him on the ropes. The younger man could feel it. The once unshakable confidence had been replaced by something else, fear, uncertainty, the first signs of doubt creeping in. Antonio was a master at reading people, and he could see that Santiago was no longer sure of his position. What's it going to be, Santiago? Antonio asked, his voice barely a whisper, but the weight of the words was enough to make the younger man pause. You really want to test me? Santiago's eyes flicked to his men, who were watching the exchange closely, unsure of what to do. Antonio's men were nowhere to be seen, but that didn't matter. Antonio had a way of making people doubt their loyalty, and Santiago's men were no different. If they saw even the slightest crack in their boss's armor, they might just turn on him. Santiago wasn't the invincible leader he thought he was. He had built his empire on fear and manipulation, but fear only worked for so long before it started to turn inward. The tension in the room was unbearable. Antonio could feel the shift, could sense that Santiago was at a crossroads. One wrong move, and he would lose everything. One moment of hesitation, and he would find himself defeated. But Antonio wasn't going to let that happen. With a slow, deliberate movement, Antonio lowered the gun, his gaze never leaving Santiago's. It wasn't a surrender, it was a calculated move, a way of signaling that he was in control. "I'm not going to kill you, Santiago," Antonio said, his voice cold but resolute. "But don't mistake that for mercy. I'm giving you a chance to walk away. To leave here with whatever's left of your pride." Santiago's eyes burned with fury, but he didn't move, didn't make a sound. Antonio had made his point. He wasn't going to let the younger man drag him down to his level. Santiago might have the numbers, but Antonio had something far more dangerous: experience, the will to survive, and the kind of resolve that could weather any storm. The standoff wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Antonio knew that he had the upper hand now. Santiago might have thought he could control this situation, but he was wrong. Antonio wasn't going to let him destroy everything he had built, and he would fight to the bitter end to ensure that his empire, his legacy, lived on. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about proving, once and for all, that the Ballad King still had his throne. And no one was going to take it from him without a fight. The quiet hum of the warehouse continued, a dull background noise to the tension that crackled in the air. The standoff between Antonio and Santiago was far from over, but the space between them had shifted. The gun that had once been pointed at Santiago now rested in Antonio's hand, the barrel lowered but still ready. The words that had passed between them echoed in Antonio's mind, each one a calculated move in a much larger game. Santiago had underestimated him before, but now it was clear, he didn't know who he was dealing with. Antonio's eyes flicked to his men, still kneeling in the shadows, awaiting his next command. They were as loyal as ever, but even loyalty had its limits. They had all seen the rise and fall of kings before, watched the mighty topple under the weight of their own hubris. Antonio knew what it was like to fight for everything, and he understood that power, once lost, was not easily regained. But what Santiago didn't understand, what he still failed to grasp, was that Antonio had been through worse. The threat that loomed now wasn't the same as the one he had faced when he was first building his empire. Back then, he was hungry, determined, but untested. Now, he had the scars, the experience, the cold knowledge of how far he was willing to go to protect what was his. Santiago, for all his bravado, hadn't yet realized the extent of Antonio's resolve. There was something in his eyes now, a flicker of doubt, that hadn't been there before. Santiago wasn't sure anymore if he had what it took to outplay Antonio. And that uncertainty was Antonio's advantage. "Are you done posturing, or do you still have a few more speeches to make?" Antonio's voice was quiet but sharp, cutting through the tension with the precision of a blade. He wasn't about to let Santiago drag this on any longer. The longer they played this game, the more chances Santiago had to regain control. Antonio wasn't going to give him that opportunity. Santiago's eyes flared with anger, his hands twitching as if he were ready to make a move, but he paused, like a dog caught in a trap. The fury was still there, but now it was laced with something else: fear. Fear that perhaps Antonio's reputation wasn't just a myth. Fear that, perhaps, he had miscalculated everything. "You think you've won?" Santiago spat, his voice harsh, his words laced with venom. "You haven't won a damn thing. The game's not over until I say it is. You've been playing catch-up from the start. You're old news, Antonio. You're a relic." Antonio's lips curled into a small smile, a knowing, almost sad smile. He had heard this before, too many times, in fact. Everyone had their theories about how his story would end, but the one thing they all underestimated was his unwillingness to be pushed aside. "You know what the problem is, Santiago?" Antonio said, his voice still soft but filled with an undeniable edge. "You think this is about winning? About power? But it's not. This is about respect. Santiago blinked, thrown off for a second by the shift in tone. For a fleeting moment, the smirk on his face wavered, replaced by confusion. Antonio could see that he was trying to process what he had just heard, but it was clear Santiago wasn't prepared for this kind of conversation. He thought of the world in terms of victories and losses, as though everything could be measured in a tally of assets, territory, and bodies. But for Antonio, it had never been about those things. Power wasn't measured in dollars or bullets, it was something deeper. It was in the way you held yourself, the way others looked at you, the way you made them feel. Antonio had spent years crafting an image, a persona that went beyond the physical world. He had learned to be more than just a man with a reputation, he had become a symbol. And that was something Santiago would never understand. Respect is earned, not given, Antonio continued, his voice calm but firm. And you, he gestured to Santiago, you haven't earned it. Not yet. And maybe you never will. The words hit harder than any bullet ever could. Santiago's face reddened with rage, but Antonio didn't flinch. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Santiago would crack under the pressure. Antonio knew how this game worked. People like Santiago were always so sure of themselves, so convinced that they had everything figured out. But that confidence, that cocky arrogance, was always their undoing. They couldn't see the cracks in their own armor until it was too late. For a long moment, Santiago remained silent. The heat of the moment was starting to wear off, and in the space between them, reality began to settle in. He wasn't going to get the better of Antonio today. The tides had shifted, and now it was Santiago who was on the defensive. Antonio could see it in the way his rival's eyes flickered to the men around him. The uncertainty had spread like wildfire, infecting his entire crew. Antonio took a step forward, never breaking eye contact with Santiago. He wasn't going to make this easy for him. He wasn't going to let Santiago believe for even a second that he could walk away from this unscathed. You want to know the truth, Santiago? Antonio said, his voice low but piercing. I've already won. Santiago opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. There was a shift in the room, something palpable that made him hesitate. For the first time, he saw it, truly saw it, Antonio wasn't afraid of him. He wasn't afraid of losing. And in that moment, Santiago realized the difference between them. Antonio didn't need to win. He had already won everything that mattered. The empire, the legacy, the respect. Santiago had been so focused on power, so focused on crushing Antonio, that he hadn't seen that what he truly sought was something Antonio had never lost. Don't mistake my restraint for weakness, Antonio said, his words slicing through the tension. You're not the first to try to take what's mine. And you won't be the last. But I'm still here. And I always will be. The message was clear. Antonio wasn't going anywhere. Santiago could play his games, try to assert dominance, but it wouldn't change the fact that Antonio had built something that couldn't be destroyed by brute force or empty threats. The weight of his presence in the room was enough to make it clear that no one, not even Santiago, could take that away from him. Santiago, now fully aware of the gravity of his situation, took a step back. His bravado was fading, replaced by a quiet resignation. Antonio's words had struck a nerve, and in that moment, Santiago knew that he had lost, not just the battle, but the war. As the standoff came to its tense end, both men stood in the silence, the air thick with unspoken understanding. Antonio knew this wasn't over, not yet. But he also knew that he had sent a message, and that message would echo long after Santiago and his men had left. Antonio Romano wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And as long as he was breathing, he would fight for his place, for his legacy, and for the men who still believed in him. The days following the confrontation were quiet, eerily so. Antonio kept to his routine, moving through his territory with the same calm precision he always had, but beneath the surface, things were shifting. Santiago's men scattered, and the whispers of the power struggle began to spread. The coastal streets, which once had an unmistakable energy, now felt different. There was an air of uncertainty hanging over the city, a feeling that something was about to change. Antonio knew better than to let his guard down. Even though Santiago had been dealt a crushing blow, there were still others lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to seize control. The underworld was like that, unpredictable, volatile. Today's victor could easily become tomorrow's prey. Antonio couldn't afford to rest on his laurels. He had worked too hard for this, built too much from the ground up. His empire wasn't just a collection of businesses, it was a fortress, one that had been carefully constructed over years. But with every victory, there were always new threats, new enemies to consider. The challenge of maintaining power was constant, and the cost of failure was always high. Antonio would have to remain vigilant, for both his future and the future of those he cared about.